Lots of stories draw their audience in by asking one fundamental question. How is this going to end? What dreams and goals will our characters accomplish? What exciting schemes will come to fruition? Who will end up kissing whom? An ever-present struggle in storytelling is how to keep an audience engaged with the story, and one of the most efficient ways to do that is to give them a big old question mark at the end of everything they're invested in. They might care about a character, but surely they'll care about them even more if they don't know if the character will even survive the story. They might wonder about the solution to a mystery, but they'll keep watching forever if you just dangle that answer a few episodes ahead of them the whole time, promising it'll be really good. They might care about a romantic subplot, but you can use that to keep them hooked if the couple keeps getting distracted by breakups and miscommunications and they never actually reach a stable dynamic. This school of thought is roundly frustrating. It frequently exposes a level of insecurity in the story itself, feeling the need to lure an audience along with a promise that eventually things will get good and make sense rather than letting the story just be good the whole time. There's a lot to be said for a story with an intriguing and unknown ending, but if a story pins all its quality on the distant finale fulfilling everything it's ever promised along the way, you run the risk of a story ending so badly that it retroactively ruins everything it ever did to build it up. Some stories will instead rely on incremental progress. Characters will have little victories along the way rather than backloading everything into a distant happily ever after. Romantic subplots will progress and resolve. Arc villains will be defeated in season finales instead of series finales. Episodic plots will have episodic happy endings that don't get undone. Questions will be answered without greater mystery caveats. In these stories, even if the full-blown ending is a little lackluster, there will still be value in a rewatch because the story did more than just set up the finale. It didn't pin all its hopes on one big question, and it gave the audience and the characters tangible rewards for sticking with it. There will still be overarching questions, and most likely how will it end is still a core question the audience is expected to ponder, but it's not a carrot on a stick drawing the audience forward. If this kind of story ends with "and the adventure continues," the audience is likely to be pretty satisfied because the adventure thus far has been rewarding, and we don't mind the implication that they'll just keep doing that fun stuff forever. And then some stories break the fundamental structure of this rule. Some stories tell you straight from the start how they're going to end, and more than that, some stories tell you that they're going to end badly. The hero is going to die, the kingdom is going to fall, the love story is doomed to end in tragedy, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their lives. Now how in the world can that possibly work? How can you ever hope to snag an audience if they know from the very start that your story's going to have a bad ending? How can they root for characters they know are doomed? Why would they willingly subject themselves to something emotionally gut-wrenching? And more mystifyingly, why are these stories so damn good? So today, let's talk about doomed heroes and why we as an audience do this to ourselves. Now to start off, let's be a little finicky with this definition. Doom comes from the Old English dom, meaning judgment, not death or destruction. A doomed hero isn't necessarily going to die, but their fate, whatever it is sealed from the beginning and usually not super fun for them. This is what distinguishes the doomed hero trope from just being another flavor of tragedy. A tragedy is defined by having a sad ending, but a doomed hero story is defined by telling us the ending at the beginning. There's obviously overlap, but they're defined by different core properties. The hero comes prejudged. The appeal is not in wondering what is going to happen, but how it's going to happen, because we know from the beginning how their story is going to end. And there are a lot of ways the audience can acquire this information. One of the most common contexts we find doomed heroes in, unsurprisingly, is prequels. In these stories, the original narrative is the doom facing the characters in the prequel series, since the end of the prequel has to set up the beginning of the original. Anyone we recognize from the original is doomed to become whatever they were in that story, whether that's villainous, dead, a soon-to-be-dead mentor, or maybe even something that isn't horribly tragic. And anyone new to the plot is doomed by canon to not be that important by the time the original timeline rolls around. Prequel-based doomed protagonists can give us a very comprehensive understanding of what fate we can expect to befall our heroes, because we've already seen all the details of what happens after. And because of the way stories are structured, typically with a problem at the beginning and a solution at the end, the world we know from the original story often starts off in a pretty bad place, which means the prequel has to end in that bad place. The question frequently becomes, what has to go catastrophically wrong to make this setting happen? How does the evil emperor rise to power? What causes the apocalyptic event that leaves the post-apocalyptic world shattered? How is this powerful family line wiped out so thoroughly that only a single long-lost descendant makes it to the original story? Prequels handily illustrate a truth that applies to all doomed hero stories. Knowing that it's going to end in tragedy changes how the story is constructed from the ground up. If we watch a prequel with no context of the original and treat it like a standalone story, the pacing would feel really really weird. Most stories work by building towards their finale, planting a lot of disparate parts and then letting everything come together in the end when all the established themes, fun power-ups, and character arcs weave together into a climactic encounter that eventually leads into a satisfying ending. But prequels and other doomed hero stories kind of work backwards from that norm. They typically start from a stable status quo and then progress towards the finale by falling apart. If a typical story starts with a problem and ends with a solution, a prequel starts with a solved situation and ends with a problem. If you're not expecting that kind of story structure, this feels incredibly unsatisfying. Suppose you watch the Star Wars prequels with no idea what Anakin turns into. The first movie seems to set him on a standard hero's journey. Plucky kid with a lot of potential gets adopted by space wizards, tale as old as time. But then the second makes him seem very creepy and evil, and the weird part is that literally nobody ever seems to notice. The logical conclusion an audience would draw is probably that Anakin is going to be the twist villain, and Obi-Wan is the hero, since he's the one actually doing heroic stuff and getting focused on. And you might be wondering why Anakin keeps getting spotlighted when he's not doing anything so relevant to the plot to warrant that focus, and he's not yet being so actively evil to make him an actual antagonist. Then the third movie starts off with a completely different version of Anakin, who is an actual hero who doesn't do exclusively creepy evil stuff with menacing music in the background and seems to actually feel bad when he does bad things. And the focus kind of shifts instead to the larger scale orchestrated fall of the Republic and the rise of the Emperor. So now we have a big bad to focus on, which is great. But remember, if we think Obi-Wan is the hero, we're going to expect him to beat the obvious villain, and the fact that he never even confronts the Emperor makes no sense. Suddenly the spotlight is fully on Anakin, and we really don't understand why. And Anakin's shift to being 100% evil feels less like a tragic downfall and more like the sudden reveal that he was always evil, since, as mentioned, he spends most of the second movie being evil and nobody but Padme notices. The third movie doesn't feel like Anakin has become evil, it feels like his evilness has finally been revealed to his closest friend, the true protagonist. So they have a fight, which is pretty cool, but the Emperor gets away scot-free, and suddenly all of Obi-Wan's focus is on Anakin's kids. It's a really weird open ending with no emotional closure because it is not designed to function as a standalone story, and treating it that way really harms its impact. But the fact is, everybody who watched those movies knew how they were going to end. The whole point of the marketing of the first movie was, how is this adorable innocent child going to become Darth Vader? Because that's definitely going to happen. With doomed hero stories, we work backwards. We start with them in a solved position, a happy ending in any other story, and then we ask the question, how does this fall apart so much that it turns into the beginning of another story? So prequel doomed heroes are in an interesting position because we already know what happens after their life falls apart, but not every doomed hero gets a sequel. Sometimes instead we know the heroes are doomed because there's a prophecy in play, and the audience has just as much information as the character does. The hero is informed by a reliable source that their downfall is assured, and the audience and the character wonder how this could possibly happen, because prophecies tend to be inconveniently lacking in specific preventable detail. Rather than starting the story with dramatic irony and more information than the heroes have, the audience follows along with the hero as they respond to this prophecy of doom in typically increasingly frantic ways. The audience might be able to predict how the hero's actions will lead to their downfall, but typically they'll only have as much information as the protagonist at any given time, so the exact mechanics of their doom remain a mystery. This is one of the only doomed hero story structures that doesn't involve dramatic irony, since while the audience still knows the hero is doomed, the hero also knows that, which is rare. Typically, doomed heroes don't know they're doomed for most of the story, which means narratives of this type, when they do see their doom coming, tend to focus in on their personal mindset and the psychology of how they respond to a sneak peek of their own ending, because that's the most unique property of these stories. And spoiler alert, most of them don't take it very well. Someone grappling with a prophesied doom will typically respond in some way that inadvertently ensures it happens, a classic self-fulfilling prophecy. But part of what makes these stories specifically compelling is that most of us can relate to the feeling of waiting for something terrible that we know is going to happen. Much like the Hitchcockian theory of suspense, waiting for the bad thing is often a much worse feeling than just having the bad thing happen. Like, anticipating getting a shot always feels way worse than the actual jab. And on a larger, worse scale, there are many real-world diagnoses, for instance, that are prophecies of doom in their own way, and it's kind of really unpleasant to think about that stuff. And this is where we start getting into one of the more inobvious appeals of doomed hero stories. Willingly experiencing tragic, painful emotions in a controlled environment can be strangely cathartic, even if every feeling the audience experiences in the process is negative. The fact is, bad things happening is a sad inevitability of being alive. We will experience sad and painful things, and while it's natural to want to run from that as much as possible, it's also natural to think about that, and to confront it. When we see a story about a doomed king learning he will someday be killed by a young lost heir to a usurped family, and we see him grappling with the sudden all-consuming awareness of his own mortality and his time running out, it echoes similar experiences that have hurt us, or will someday hurt us. Anyone who's ever acted or played a game of D&D knows the strange appeal of playing a character experiencing something terrible. The character is pretty much guaranteed to hate every minute, but with the protective sheath of fiction surrounding us, it can be oddly appealing for us as players and actors to immerse ourselves in crushing tragedy or agony or desperate madness experienced at arm's length. While most doomed heroes experience sudden tragedy that only the audience knew was inevitable, prophecy-doomed heroes see their inevitable end coming and react like a person who knows they're running out of time. And there's a special kind of tragedy in that, and while it's not fun to live through, it can be compelling to watch. It's similar but not identical to a different framing sequence we sometimes find doomed heroes in, the story of how I died. These stories almost unilaterally open with a narration from the hero explaining that they are doomed, or a flash forward showing us the moment of their downfall. We then watch the hero play out the story up to that point, learning in the process how exactly their doom happened. This subtype is unique in how often it completely cheats. Most other doomed hero stories commit to the sad ending, but stories specifically framed this way will often throw in a surprise twist about how the hero is actually fine, or was brought back immediately and thus didn't stay dead or whatever. This might be because implicit in the story of how I died framing is the question, how is the character narrating if they died, but you also get stories that open with a flash forward to how they died and then just reveal that they're actually fine, or they had a Chekhov's gun on hand to get them out of their specific desperate situation. It's fine and can be very fun, but like, if I'm sitting down for a good tragedy, I want to see a tragedy, and the best story of how I dieds make good on that promise. There are also a couple unique formats for doomed heroes that play out specifically in story, and they are the Apocalypse Log and the Time Loop. Apocalypse Logs are pretty simple. They're a doomed hero story within a story that our protagonists encounter and unravel just like we, the audience, would in a typical doomed hero narrative. Apocalypse Logs are usually diaries or audio logs where someone keeps a record of some event they're living through, like an experiment or an expedition, but even before the heroes get to the end of the journal, context clues usually inform them that things went wrong long before the apocalypse log reaches that point. Maybe the journal is found on a dead body or in an abandoned facility full of skeletons and facehuggers or something. The more terrifying or bleak the circumstances it's found in, the more worrying it is when the log opens with something like, "Everything's going totally great. We just threw a birthday party for Ensign Frank and the captain passed around free therapy dogs for everyone." Frequently, the heroes will have to get through the log post-haste because the thing that killed whoever wrote it is still around, and this knowledge might be the only way they can get an edge on surviving it. I have a lot of personal love for this specific trope, and it is entirely because the Mines of Moria scarred me at an early age. There's something extra impactful about seeing our protagonists processing the secondhand story of this poor doomed character's last moments, documented for posterity to give them a shot at survival. And they're also very spooky, but in a nice arm's length kind of way. Sure, the threat might still be around, but at least the heroes aren't fighting it blind, and the audience has the comfort of knowing some hint of what to expect. It's a lot more fun than sitting in a horror movie waiting for a jump scare to pop out. And then there's the time loop variant, where, like in the Apocalypse Log, the characters are experiencing all the greatest hits of the doomed hero plotline from a slightly meta perspective, but like the Prophecy variant, the hero is also experiencing it directly with the knowledge that they are doomed. In time loop plots, doomed heroes experience the same tragedies over and over again, typically trying to find ways to fix them, to stop the tragedy, to save themselves or a loved one, or even to escape the time loop in cases where they aren't willingly resetting the timeline to try and get it right. Like in the Prophecy case, they know they're doomed and they're fighting back, but the time loop adds one unique bit of flavor. We don't just see the hero fail once. Where a standard tragedy only needs to contrive the hero's downfall one time, in a time loop the hero gets to try all sorts of different things to escape, and they typically fail over and over again, which can be very disheartening for them. Time loop stories need to be careful not to overdo it, though. Sometimes it can feel like the contrivances required to doom the hero over and over again are just absurdly unlikely, and if the universe seems to only follow the rule of this character is doomed and I don't care how it happens as long as they can't be saved, then the hero's time loop struggles can seem utterly pointless and disengaging because the fictional universe is being actively unfair. But on the flip side, if the time loop presents a suitably complex problem and it makes sense the hero would need that many tries to get it right, it can be very cool seeing the hero become more and more competent and powerful as they learn from their mistakes. It's kind of a balance, making the tragedy seem heartbreaking and inevitable and nearly impossible to stop without making it so contrived that the audience slips out of the immersion and gets mad at the author for cheating. Unusually, these doomed hero stories sometimes have actual non-cheating happy endings when someone finds a way to thwart the tragedy and the time loop resolves. This works because we still get to see the tragedy play out to its conclusion over and over again, so it's not like the story doesn't commit to the bit. But since the entire point of the premise is to try and prevent the tragedy, that is one of the most logical ways to end the story. The tragedy that played out dozens or hundreds of times is finally prevented, the loop is broken, and everyone gets to move on. This is one of the only doomed hero narratives where the hero can escape their fate at the end, and it doesn't feel like a cop-out because we got to see the tragic tragic narrative play out, and it had a lasting impact. But this is definitely the exception and not the rule. For the most part, doomed hero stories are bummers. The heroes struggle against their fate, but they're eventually crushed by the inevitable. But in spite of that, there are a lot of ways these stories can be appealing to an audience. Not necessarily fun, but like, good. In the same way a really hard workout or a nice long cry can hurt in a strangely soothing way, doomed hero stories can have aspects that can make them enjoyable to experience without at any point being nice or fun. We've already discussed the widespread use of dramatic irony in this genre, which is when the audience has information the characters don't. If we see a character blundering into a situation that we know is going to ruin them, we're helpless to stop them, but we also kinda can't look away. This is like 90% of the appeal of disaster documentaries that recount dramatizations of real historical tragedies the audience is expected to know about going in. If we're dealing with a story about the Titanic or Pompeii or Chernobyl, we get the ache of dramatic irony from seeing regular people living their lives as though they aren't mere hours away from becoming very interesting footnotes in a future textbook. This taps into an unfortunate truth of being alive, which is that we can't predict when bad things are going to happen to us. Trying to predict all future bad stuff to protect yourself from it is an anxiety disorder. All the people in these stories, and in reality, are living their lives without a third-person omniscient perspective on their character arcs, and tend to operate on the assumption that their life will continue on at the same speed and in the same direction unless some force acts upon it. This is reasonable because the fact is, the forces that can whack a life in a completely new direction are unpredictable, and trying to predict or forestall every possible danger is a recipe for not taking any potentially rewarding risks and then getting walloped by unexpected consequences anyway. There's nothing wrong with being cautious about known dangers and exercising common sense, but none of us know how our lives are gonna go, and while there are some threats we can minimize, we just can't keep ourselves 100% safe, and there's gonna come a time when we deal with the impact of some terrible thing we couldn't have predicted or stopped. Being put in the role of an omniscient audience seeing someone else's life play out can give us a controlled taste of that nightmare scenario from a safely removed perspective. We aren't being haplessly buffeted by sudden cruel twists of fate, we're seeing it happen to someone else with the benefit of advance warning letting us know exactly what's coming for them. It's not a good feeling, but it's appealing in its own way. The same principle applies to catharsis, a term from ancient Greece that describes the purging of strong emotions through the medium of art and theater. An audience can experience positive emotions like triumph and joy through art, but also strong negative emotions like grief, fear, and rage by the proxy of the POV characters. The process of engaging with and finishing a story that causes those emotions can also allow an audience to release those emotions in a controlled manner, because once the story is over, so is the emotional trigger. Like sometimes you're feeling kinda lousy and you decide to watch something you know is gonna be heartbreaking because that'll let you get out the bad feelings through a controlled release. And if you were in a better mood, maybe you wouldn't want to watch that thing even if you knew it was good, because it would put you in a much more volatile emotional state than general chillness. These are feelings that everyone experiences at various times, typically under circumstances that we can't control. If something is making us sad or afraid or angry, we might be able to control our relation to that trigger, removing ourselves from the situation or comforting ourselves with unrelated joys to mitigate the effects. But generally, the things that make us feel bad are not things we have direct power over, which can make them feel much worse. Any situation can become miserable if you can't leave, because the mere state of being stuck somewhere grates on us. But there is an appeal in exploring these emotions in a controlled and separate context. We obviously don't want to lose loved ones, but maybe we'll watch a movie where someone experiences that kind of bone-deep grief and immerse ourselves in the mindset with the benefit of knowing it's fictional. It's like the relief of waking up from a nightmare and knowing every terrible, heartbreaking thing you were just forced to process is suddenly irrelevant, but with the benefit that you get to choose when to wake up. Doomed hero stories promise that we will see our hero experience the kind of terrible fate we would never want to experience ourselves, and that can be an interesting flavor to sample. But these stories aren't actually all doom and gloom. One huge benefit of this narrative structure is because the audience knows the heroes are doomed, the bar is set really, really low. In any other story, the hero dies at the end would be such a huge bummer that it majorly offsets any other victories they might have won along the way. But if we already know that and we're braced for it, those little victories we weren't expecting can be much more impactful. Maybe the doomed hero manages to limit the damage caused by whatever ends up killing them, or they saved their loved ones, or they fling a light into the future and give future generations a chance of understanding and maybe even fixing the nightmare that doomed them. These stories prepare their audience for the worst, but that means even tiny bright spots stand out very strongly against the dark. The benefit of an outlook that's prepared for the worst is that every good thing that happens is always a pleasant surprise, and many doomed hero stories will go out of their way to reward the audience with little moments of optimism and hope and real, tangible good accomplished by the doomed heroes. It's still sad, but it's a sadness tempered with hope. and more meaningfully with actual practical good deeds. This might be a bit of a hot take, but while hoping things will get better is all well and good, and hope is very important as a concept overall and cannot be abandoned, watching hopeful heroes hold on to that hope in the face of despair and then struggle, fail, and die pointlessly kind of loops back around to looking hopeless. Like, yeah, they had hope. Look at all the good it did them. This is a major frustration I have with grimdark narratives where the hero's struggles, while impressive, go completely unrewarded by the narrative. Instead, doomed hero stories will sometimes let their heroes struggle against their doom in a way that demonstrably, tangibly helps someone who actually can survive the story. Rescuing loved ones, or mitigating a disaster and saving lives that way. There are lots of ways to reward a doomed hero without saving them. And while it's not strictly necessary for a doomed hero to get a consolation not as doomed as he could have been, a lot of the most well-liked doomed hero narratives do give them a win, even if it's a very small one. Sometimes we go into a story knowing the hero is doomed, but sometimes we get to see a little further, and the story shows us that their doom is not the most important part of this character's life. Sometimes they get to matter beyond that, even if nobody but the audience ever knows what they did. There is an odd, heartbreaking, satisfying grief in bearing witness to the heroics of a protagonist who's been dead from the beginning, who cannot possibly save themselves and is no longer trying, who is instead using every second they have left in the narrative to make the story a better place for everyone who will outlive them. Because while we spend most of our lives caring for ourselves and driving our own narratives, at the end of the day, no matter what the night holds and what secret tragedies may be lurking for us, we can always choose to be kind, and that will always matter. So, yeah.